This is a basic introduction to the construction of compound or composite variables. Now, these variables are particularly useful in building indices, and natural scientists and social scientists use these variables quite a bit. Now, a compound or composite variable is based on a combination of two or more variables to produce one variable, and in some cases, this may be referred to as a score. Now, the logic behind it is that it is a really useful way of measuring phenomenon which may be dependent on or a function of several attributes. In this example, I'm going to be attempting to measure what I describe as sense of vulnerability. Now, based on the data from my questionnaire, I'm using about three key variables to measure sense of vulnerability. Now, here are my variables outlined at the top. Now let's go to the variable view, and these will be the variables I will be using to measure sense of vulnerability. I'm going to be using disaster, crime, and poverty. Now, that's of course the abbreviated name. The variable disaster asks individuals, do you believe you are vulnerable to natural disasters? For crime, do you believe you're vulnerable to crime? And for poverty, do you believe you're vulnerable to economic hardships? And of course, this was to get a sense of vulnerability across, amongst my respondents. Now, I'm going to combine these three variables, disaster, crime, and poverty, to derive what I describe as a sense of vulnerability score. Now, these variables are nominal variables. They're dichotomous nominal variables, right? Because they're measured using two categories, yes and no. Gender is also a dichotomous nominal variable. Now, I'm going to treat these variables, however, like ordinal variables. Despite the fact that they are entered as nominal here, I'm going to treat them like ordinal variables, simply because I have assigned weighting to each of the categories. So 1, I'm going to ascribe a weighting of 1 to 1 and 0 if the respondent says no. And this weighting will have implications for the overall score. In that, if an individual answers 1 to all three questions, that is disaster, crime, and poverty, then that individual can be probably estimated or evaluated as having a high sense of vulnerability. The polar opposite would occur if that individual answers no to all three cases. To all three questions rather. We could always say that that person has no sense of vulnerability, or it's probably better to say that person has a very low sense of vulnerability. And bear in mind, this is just a basic measure. Now, it is going to require only simple addition. We have assigned to our variables um, categories with codes of 1 and 0. So the maximum score can only be 3. Now let us proceed to computing our variable. We go to compute, transform, compute variable, and the target variable is that new variable that is going to be created. Let us call that variable sense of vol. And of course, remember that SPSS is very sensitive to illegal characters, so you can't include spaces and I think number signs and so forth. Now, if you use these three variables, let us use this one. This one is disaster. I'm gonna add disaster to crime. Let's send it over. Then add crime and poverty, and click OK. Now, nothing really will come up in the output except the syntax for the operation. I am going to now go back to my variable view, and in the variable view you'll notice that one variable has been added to the list of variables. This is my new variable, sense of vol, which was created. Now I can label that variable sense of vulnerability. Sense of vulnerability. And this is my, in essence, my vulnerability score. Now, let us go to my data view, and you will see the scores displayed. But when I click the tag, the value labels are there for pretty much most of the other variables. Certainly the variables that were used in the construction of this compound variable, all the value labels are there, but there are no value labels for sense of vulnerability. It's because we have not yet assigned these labels, so we have not yet decided what a 1 or a 2 or a 0 might mean. Now we will proceed to the next step by doing that. Now let us assign these values. Now 1, we can, if someone was to score 0, we could say that that person has no vulnerability or low vulnerability, but let's call it low vulnerability. Low vulnerability. 1, we could also say that they have low vulnerability. 2, probably we could say that they have maybe a moderate vulnerability, moderate level of vulnerability. And since, actually, I'm gonna delete vulnerability from these, since the variable label already has vulnerability in it. So when graphs or frequency tables are produced, it might seem a little bit, redundant to me saying low vulnerability, moderate vulnerability, high vulnerability. So let us change that. And I'm gonna add as well. Oh, jeez, I changed that by mistake. So let me add to moderate. Add, and then 3. We describe that person as having a high vulnerability, high sense of vulnerability, because they are at the upper limit of our sense of vulnerability scale. So click OK, and let us go back to our data view, and in our data view, our vulnerability is measured. Our labels have been assigned to our vulnerability scores, and we have categorized this data. Now, there are many things that can be done with this categorized data. You could find the association between this new compound variable and another variable such as gender. You can find the, you could probably run some frequencies, and of course, they can be used in more complex statistical procedures. Now, that is it for the creation of a compound variable. This was a very basic introduction involving only the basic mathematical operations. We only used addition in this case. Of course, much more complex mathematical operations could be conducted in terms of computing scores. We could also compute percentages by, bracketing what we had there and, dividing it by, by 100, well, multiplying it by 100. Dividing it out of 3, rather. Dividing it by 3 and multiplying it by 100. So that is it for this exercise.